The monsoon had arrived early in Mumbai that year, catching the city off guard with sheets of rain that turned Marine Drive into a river of red taillights and frustrated honking. Meera Nair stood at the window of the production office in Andheri West, watching the chaos below while behind her, the editing suite hummed with the controlled frenzy of a film 3 weeks from release. The coffee in her hand had gone cold an hour ago, but she kept holding it, needing something to anchor her hands, while her mind raced through the inconsistencies she discovered in the footage. Outside, a billboard for the Colaba Confession loomed over the street, the tagline promising "the truth that shook Mumbai" in letters that bled dramatically into darkness. The irony wasn't lost on her that truth, in this building, had become as malleable as the CGI effects being added 2 floors down. The production office occupied the entire 15th floor of a glass tower that had sprouted during the streaming boom, when Netflix and Amazon had turned Bollywood into a content factory running 3 shifts. Meera had been hired 6 months ago as a script consultant, her journalism background supposedly lending authenticity to a film based on the 2019 murder of Priya D'Souza, a young investment banker whose body had been found in her Colaba apartment. The case had dominated news cycles for months, a perfect storm of wealth, beauty, and mystery that Mumbai's media machine had consumed and regurgitated until the facts had become indistinguishable from speculation. Now, as she reviewed the raw interview footage with witnesses that would never make the final cut, Meera felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came when stories didn't align. "Still here, Meera?" Arjun Malhotra's voice carried the practiced warmth he deployed like a tool, calibrated perfectly for each interaction. The director stood in the doorway, his black kurta impeccable despite the 16-hour day, his beard trimmed with the precision of someone who understood that appearance was half of authority in this industry. At 42, Arjun had built his reputation on hard-hitting social dramas that won awards at international festivals while maintaining enough commercial appeal to satisfy producers. This film was supposed to be his crossover to global streaming platforms, the project that would put him alongside Anurag Kashyap and Zoya Akhtar in the pantheon of directors who'd transcended Bollywood's traditional boundaries. Going through the interview archives, Meera replied, minimizing the window on her laptop that showed a time-stamp discrepancy she'd been analyzing, making sure our narrative aligns with the documented facts. Arjun's laugh was dry, almost bitter. "Facts are what we make them, Meera. You should know that better than anyone." He was referring to her past, the investigative piece she'd written 3 years ago about corruption in Mumbai's construction industry that had led to a witness being murdered 2 days after publication. The guilt from that still woke her at 3 a.m., a reminder that truth without protection was just another form of violence. "The victim's sister is coming tomorrow," Arjun continued, settling into the chair across from her desk. The room smelled of stale air conditioning and the peculiar mixture of anxiety and ambition that permeated every production office in Mumbai. "Priya D'Souza wants to see the final cut before release. Kabir is nervous." Kabir Shah, the producer, had reasons to be nervous that went beyond courtesy screenings. His production company, Shah Entertainment, had survived the economic devastation of the pandemic by pivoting to true crime content, mining Mumbai's endless supply of sensational cases for streaming platforms hungry for authentic Indian narratives. But Kabir's connections ran deeper than business. His uncle was a sitting member of the Maharashtra Legislative Assembly, and his cousin headed the Mumbai Police's crime branch. These relationships had opened doors to case files and witnesses that other producers couldn't access, but they also came with obligations that Meera was only beginning to understand. "What does she expect to see?" Meera asked, though she knew the answer. Families always wanted clarity, resolution, a narrative that made sense of senseless loss. What they got was usually something else entirely. Their pain repackaged as entertainment, their loved ones reduced to plot points in someone else's story. She wants to see her sister's killer brought to justice, even if only on screen, Arjun said. The problem is, we're not entirely sure who that is, are we? This was the heart of the matter. The film portrayed Vikram Mehta, Priya's ex-boyfriend, as the killer, following the police's official conclusion, despite the fact that charges had been dropped due to insufficient evidence. But the more Meera had researched, the more holes she'd found in the timeline, the more witnesses whose stories had shifted between initial statements and final testimonies. Most troubling were the missing 48 minutes from the building's security footage on the night of the murder, a gap that the police had attributed to technical malfunction, but which seemed too convenient to be accidental. Her phone buzzed with a WhatsApp message from her source at the cybercrime unit, a contact from her journalism days who still trusted her despite everything. Check the metadata on the confession video. Something's off. Indeed, the confession video was the centerpiece of the film, a dramatic recording supposedly made by Vikram to a friend hours after the murder. It had never been submitted as evidence due to questions about its authenticity, but Arjun had rebuilt it scene by scene, turning speculation into cinematic truth. "I need to show you something," Meera said, pulling up the files she'd been analyzing. "The confession video that we're basing the climax on, the timestamp shows it was created 3 days after the murder, not the night of, and the location data places it in Bandra, not Colaba." Arjun's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes, a recognition of danger that he quickly suppressed. "Digital timestamps can be wrong. Phones malfunction. You know this." "Multiple malfunctions? All pointing in the same direction?" Meera pulled up another file. "And there's more. The witness who claimed to see Vikram leaving the building, Amit Sharma, he was facing eviction from his shop by Priya's father's company. That never made it into the police reports." The rain intensified outside, drumming against the windows with monsoon fury. Somewhere in the building, a generator kicked in as the power flickered, a common occurrence during the season, but one that always felt ominous in moments like these. Arjun stood up, walked to the window, his reflection ghost-like in the glass against the city lights beyond. "You know what this film means to me," he said quietly. "After the Dharavi Dreams failed at the box office, I need this. We all need this. The streaming deal alone will fund 3 more projects, give jobs to hundreds of crew members who've been struggling since the pandemic." "At what cost?" Meera asked. "If we're wrong about Vikram, if we're destroying an innocent man's life for the sake of a compelling narrative." "He's not innocent. Maybe not guilty of murder, but innocent. Nobody in this story is innocent, Meera. Not Vikram, not Priya, not the family, not the police, not us." Arjun turned back to her, and she saw the exhaustion beneath his composed exterior, the weight of compromises that had brought him to this point. The question isn't about innocence. It's about which version of guilt makes the most sense, tells the best story, serves the greatest good. Before Meera could respond, the door burst open and Kabir Shah entered, his usual swagger dampened by obvious agitation. At 35, Kabir had the soft features and expensive clothes of someone who'd inherited rather than earned his position, but Meera had learned not to underestimate him. Behind the Bollywood party boy facade was a sharp mind that understood the machinery of influence better than anyone she'd met. "We have a problem," Kabir announced, his phone clutched in his hand like a grenade. "Someone leaked rough cuts to a journalist at Scroll. They're planning an exposé about the film's departures from facts. If this runs before our release, we're finished. The CBFC will pull our certificate, the streaming platforms will back out, and we'll be left with a 100 crore disaster." The Central Board of Film Certification had already been nervous about the film, requiring 17 cuts to remove references to political figures peripherally connected to the case. Another controversy would give them the excuse to ban it entirely. Meera felt the walls of the office closing in, the weight of decisions that would ripple far beyond this room. She thought about Ria D'Souza, who would arrive tomorrow seeking closure, and about Vikram Mehta, who'd already fled to Dubai to escape the shame of accusation. "Who leaked it?" Arjun asked, though his eyes moved to Meera with unspoken suspicion. "Does it matter?" Kabir replied. "We need to control this. My uncle can make some calls, delay the article, maybe kill it entirely if we're lucky. But we need to be united. No more digging into things that don't need digging into. The film is finished. The story is set. We move forward." Meera looked at both men, seeing clearly for the first time the cage she'd walked into. This wasn't about truth or justice or even art. It was about survival in an industry where reality was just raw material to be shaped, packaged, and sold. The rain continued its assault on the windows, and somewhere in the city, the real killer of Priya D'Souza was probably watching television, knowing that someone else would pay for their crime, at least in the public imagination. The next morning arrived with the kind of suffocating humidity that made Mumbai feel like a pressure cooker about to explode. Meera had spent the night in her small flat in Versova, unable to sleep, going through every piece of evidence she'd collected over the past 6 months. The walls of her bedroom had become an investigation board, with strings connecting photos, timelines, and newspaper clippings in a pattern that made sense only to her. Her neighbor's television blared a morning show discussing the upcoming release of The Colaba Confession, with film critics debating whether true crime cinema had a responsibility to the truth or to entertainment. The irony of the question made her stomach turn. She arrived at the production office to find it transformed into a presentation space for Ria D'Souza's visit. The conference room had been cleared of its usual chaos of scripts and storyboards, replaced with a careful arrangement of flowers and a portrait of Priya that made the space feel more like a memorial than a movie studio. Kabir was already there, wearing a white kurta that suggested mourning and respect, a calculated choice that Meera recognized as part of his arsenal of manipulation. Arjun stood by the projection screen, testing the equipment with the obsessive attention to detail that had made him successful. Ria arrived precisely at 10, accompanied by her lawyer and her aunt, a formidable woman whose presence immediately changed the room's dynamics. Ria was 28, 3 years younger than her murdered sister, but grief had aged her in ways that showed in the tightness around her eyes and the careful way she held herself, as if movement might cause her to shatter. She wore a simple salwar kameez in muted blue, her hair pulled back severely, all jewelry removed except for a small pendant that Meera recognized from photos as matching one Priya had worn. "Thank you for agreeing to show me the film," Ria said, her voice steady but quiet. "I know you're not obligated to do this. Your sister's story deserves to be told with respect," Kabir responded, his sincerity so well performed that Meera almost believed it herself. "We want to ensure we've honored her memory." They settled into the plush chairs as the lights dimmed and the film began. Meera watched Ria's face in the screen's glow, seeing every flinch at the recreated violence, every tear at the moments of invented intimacy between the actress playing Priya and her on-screen killer. The film was beautifully shot, Arjun's direction elevating what could have been exploitation into something that felt almost profound. But Meera knew the lies beneath the artistry, the way scenes had been crafted to support a conclusion that the evidence didn't fully support. Halfway through, during a particularly brutal interrogation scene where Vikram's character broke down and confessed, Ria suddenly stood up. "Stop it," she said, her voice cracking. "Stop the film." The lights came on, revealing her face streaked with tears, but set with determination. "That's not what happened. Vikram and Priya, they weren't like that. She loved him, even after they broke up. She told me the night before she died that she was thinking of calling him, of trying again. Artistic license requires us to dramatize certain elements," Arjun began, but Ria cut him off. "This isn't artistic license. This is character assassination. You've turned him into a monster because it makes a better story, but what if you're wrong? What if the real killer is out there laughing at how you've gift-wrapped someone else for their crime? The room fell silent except for the hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of construction from the building next door. Mira felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge, knowing she could tip it either way with what she knew. She thought about the missing security footage, the manipulated confession video, the witness with a grudge, all the pieces that suggested a different story than the one playing on the screen. There are inconsistencies in the evidence, Mira heard herself saying, even as she felt Kabir's glare burning into her. Things that don't add up if Vikram is guilty. Ria turned to her, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time. What kind of inconsistencies? Before Mira could answer, Kabir's phone rang. He looked at the screen, and his face went pale. "I need to take this," he said, stepping out of the room. Through the glass door, they could see him pacing, gesticulating wildly as he spoke. Arjun seized the moment to redirect the conversation. "Ria, I understand your concerns, but we've worked closely with the police, reviewed all the evidence. The film reflects the official investigation's conclusions, the official investigation that couldn't even bring charges." Ria's lawyer, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "My client has been patient with this production, hoping it might bring some closure, but if you're simply repeating police incompetence for entertainment..." Kabir burst back in, his composure completely shattered. "The Scroll article just went live. They have everything. The fake timestamp on the confession, the witness's connection to Priya's father, even suggestions that someone in the production might have evidence of the real killer." Everyone turned to look at Mira. She felt the weight of their stares, the accusation in them. But before she could defend herself, Ria's phone buzzed with a notification. She read it, her face cycling through confusion, shock, and then something that looked like rage. "Is this true?" She held up her phone, showing a social media post from a crew member who'd worked on the film. "Did you find evidence that implicated someone else and chose to ignore it for your story?" The post was already going viral, shared across WhatsApp groups and Twitter threads that moved faster than truth could ever hope to travel. Mira recognized the crew member, a junior editor who'd been fired 2 weeks ago for asking too many questions about the narrative choices. Apparently, he'd decided to burn everything down on his way out. "We need to control this narrative," Kabir said, already typing on his phone. "I'm calling an emergency press conference. Arjun, we'll position this as a misunderstanding, a disgruntled employee spreading lies. Mira, you'll support our version of events." "Will I?" Mira asked, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "Because I've been documenting everything I've found, every discrepancy, every piece of evidence that points away from Vikram. I came to this project to help tell the truth, not to manufacture it." "The truth?" Kabir laughed bitterly. "The truth is that we have 200 crores invested in this film. The truth is that international streaming rights depend on us delivering a completed narrative. The truth is that if this film fails, Shah Entertainment goes under and 300 families lose their income. Is your truth worth that?" Ria stood between them, trembling with emotion. "My sister is dead. That's the only truth that matters to me. If this film isn't going to help find her real killer, then what's the point? What am I supposed to tell my parents, who think this movie will finally give them peace?" The room erupted into arguments, voices overlapping in a chaos that matched the storm brewing outside. Through the window, Mira could see dark clouds gathering over the Arabian Sea, the kind that preceded the worst of the monsoon downpours. The city below continued its relentless pace, unaware of the small drama playing out in this glass tower, just one of thousands of stories being written and rewritten in Mumbai's endless narrative machine. Arjun's voice cut through the noise with director's authority. "Enough. We have 3 weeks until release. The film is cut, the publicity is in motion, the deals are signed. We can't unmake what we've made." But he paused, looking at Mira with something that might have been respect. "We can add context, a disclaimer perhaps, additional materials that acknowledge the ambiguities in the case." "That's not enough," Ria said. "If you have evidence about my sister's real killer—" "We don't," Kabir interrupted. "We have questions, doubts, theories, nothing that would stand up in court, nothing that would bring you closure." But Mira knew that wasn't entirely true. That morning, she'd received another message from her cybercrime contact. The missing 48 minutes of security footage had been recovered from a backup server that the building's management company hadn't disclosed. She hadn't watched it yet, afraid of what it might reveal, afraid of the responsibility that would come with knowing. The press conference was scheduled for that evening at the Taj Mahal Palace Hotel, a venue that spoke of respectability and tradition, chosen to counteract the chaos spreading online. Mira sat in the back of the car with Arjun and Kabir, watching the city blur past through rain-streaked windows. The streets were flooding in the low-lying areas, forcing their driver to take detours through parts of Mumbai that rarely appeared in films except as backdrop for poverty porn or crime dramas. Nobody spoke during the ride, each lost in their own calculations of damage and survival. The recovered security footage sat on Mira's laptop like a ticking bomb. She'd finally watched it an hour before leaving for the press conference, alone in a bathroom stall where no one could see her reaction. The 48 minutes showed something that changed everything. Priya D'Souza opening her door not to Vikram, but to someone else entirely. Someone whose face was familiar, but whose presence in that place at that time made no sense according to the official narrative. The quality was poor, the angle unfortunate, but with enhancement, the identity would be unmistakable. The Taj's ballroom had been transformed into a media battleground, with reporters from every major outlet in India and several international correspondents drawn by the scandal. The film's poster stood behind the podium like an accusation, Priya's face rendered in dramatic shadows that now seemed more ominous than artistic. Mira noticed Ria sitting in the front row, flanked by her lawyer and what appeared to be a detective from the crime branch, their presence a clear message that this was no longer just about cinema. Kabir took the podium first, his politician's training evident in the way he commanded attention without seeming to demand it. "We're here to address the baseless allegations that have been circulated about our film," he began, his voice carrying the perfect blend of indignation and disappointment. "The Colaba Confession is a work of cinema based on publicly available information about a tragic case. We have never claimed to be a documentary, nor have we suggested that our narrative is the definitive truth. The reporters weren't buying it." Hands shot up immediately, voices calling out questions about the evidence, about the leaked information, about the ethics of profiting from tragedy. Kabir fielded them with practiced ease, deflecting, redirecting, occasionally acknowledging concerns without admitting fault. It was a masterclass in crisis management, except for one problem. The truth had a way of breaking through even the best spin. "Mr. Shah," a reporter from The Hindu called out, "is it true that your production company suppressed evidence that could exonerate Vikram Mehta?" Before Kabir could answer, Mira found herself standing up. The room turned to her, cameras swiveling like predators sensing weakness. She walked to the podium, her legs steadier than she'd expected, her mind clear for the first time in weeks. "My name is Mira Nair," she said, her voice carrying across the ballroom. "I was hired as a script consultant for this film because of my background in investigative journalism. In that capacity, I have discovered significant discrepancies between the film's narrative and the available evidence." The room exploded with camera flashes and shouted questions, but Mira continued. "More importantly, I have recently obtained security footage from the night of Priya D'Souza's murder that was thought to be lost. This footage requires proper analysis by law enforcement, not speculation by filmmakers or journalists." She pulled out a USB drive, holding it up for the cameras to see. "I am turning this evidence over to the police immediately following this press conference. The family deserves answers, not entertainment. The accused deserves justice, not trial by cinema." Kabir grabbed the microphone, his face flushed with rage. Ms. Nair is no longer associated with this production. Her statements are her own and do not reflect, but his words were drowned out by the chaos that followed. Ria D'Souza had stood up, tears streaming down her face, and was pushing through the crowd toward Mira. The detective was speaking rapidly into his phone, presumably calling for backup or authorization. Arjun remained seated on the stage, his expression unreadable, watching his film's narrative collapse in real time. Security moved in to escort Mira out, but Ria reached her first, gripping her hands with desperate strength. "The footage," she whispered urgently. "Does it show who really killed her?" "It shows someone entering her apartment," Mira replied quietly, aware of the microphones straining to catch their words. "Someone who wasn't supposed to be there, according to everything we've been told." The detective intervened then, taking the USB drive and Mira's contact information, promising a full investigation. As Mira was led out through a side entrance, she caught a glimpse of Kabir's face, saw the fear there that went beyond professional concern. She thought about his connections, his family's political ties, the web of influence that had made this film possible. And she wondered if the person in that footage was connected to that web in ways that would make the truth more dangerous than any lie. Outside, the monsoon had unleashed its full fury on Mumbai. The gateway of India was barely visible through the sheets of rain, and the usual crowds of tourists and locals had fled for shelter. Mira stood under the hotel's entrance canopy, watching the storm and feeling oddly calm. Her phone was buzzing constantly with calls and messages, but she ignored them all except one, a text from her old editor at the newspaper where she'd worked before everything went wrong. "Heard what you did. Proud of you. If you want to write the real story, you have a platform here. The real story. As if there was ever just one story, one truth that could satisfy everyone." But Mira knew she would write it anyway. Not the sensational exposé that would generate clicks and controversy, but the careful, methodical investigation that might actually lead to justice. She thought about the witness who died after her last investigation, the guilt that had driven her from journalism to the supposed safety of fiction. But fiction, she'd learned, could be just as dangerous when it wore the mask of truth. A car pulled up, sent by Arjun. He was in the back seat, looking older than his years, the weight of his collapsed ambitions visible in every line of his face. "Get in," he said. "We need to talk." Aich, they drove through the flooded streets in silence at first, passing the shanties of Dharavi, where Arjun had shot his breakthrough film, past the towers of Bandra Kurla complex, where money moved in quantities that could fund 1,000 movies, through the old mill district where Bollywood had been born in converted warehouses and dreams. "The person in the footage," Arjun finally said. "I think I know who it is. And if I'm right, this goes much higher than Kabir's family connections." "Who?" Mira asked, though part of her already suspected. "Someone who was supposedly in Delhi that night, attending a judicial conference. Someone whose alibi was never questioned because of their position." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Someone who had been having an affair with Priya, an affair that would have destroyed careers and reputations if it became public." Mira felt the pieces clicking into place, the pattern emerging from the chaos. A judge, a senior judge who had presided over several cases involving Priya's father's business interests, the kind of person whose word would never be questioned, whose movements were above suspicion, whose power made them untouchable. "What do we do?" she asked. "We?" Arjun laughed bitterly. "There is no we anymore. The film is dead. My career is probably over. Kabir will survive because people like him always do. But you," he looked at her with something like admiration, "you have a chance to do what I never could, tell the truth, regardless of the cost." They pulled up outside Mira's building. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the city was beginning to emerge from its temporary paralysis. Street vendors were setting up their stalls again. Taxi drivers were honking for fares, and life was reasserting its relentless rhythm. Mumbai was a city that absorbed trauma and scandal like the Arabian Sea, absorbed the monsoon, vast and indifferent, and somehow always ready for the next wave. 3 days after the press conference, Mumbai woke to headlines that shifted the entire narrative once again. The security footage had been analyzed, enhanced, and the figure entering Priya D'Souza's apartment had been identified. Justice Ravindra Khanna, a senior judge with an impeccable reputation and political ambitions that everyone knew, but no one discussed openly. The news broke not through traditional media, which hesitated to accuse such a powerful figure, but through a coordinated leak to multiple independent journalists who published simultaneously, making suppression impossible. Meera watched the coverage from a safe house that the newspaper had arranged after death threats started arriving at her apartment. The room was sparse but functional, with multiple locks on the door and windows that faced a busy street where any suspicious activity would be noticed. She was writing her comprehensive report on the case, documenting not just the murder, but the entire ecosystem of power, influence, and media manipulation that had tried to bury the truth under layers of convenient fiction. Her phone rang with a video call from Priya D'Souza, who looked simultaneously vindicated and devastated. "They arrested him this morning," she said, her voice hollow. "Justice Khanna, he confessed rather than face trial, said it was an accident, that they argued about him ending the affair, that she threatened to expose him." She paused, wiping tears with the back of her hand. "All this time, we blamed Vikram. The media destroyed him. Your film would have cemented his guilt forever." "I'm sorry," Meera said, knowing how inadequate the words were. "I should have found the truth sooner." "You found it when no one else was looking," Priya replied. "The police had closed the case in their minds. The media had moved on to other scandals. If not for the film forcing everyone to pay attention again, even wrongly, we might never have known." It was a generous interpretation, but Meera couldn't accept that comfort. The film had been built on lies, and those lies had nearly become accepted truth. She thought about all the other cases that had been transformed into entertainment, all the other families whose pain had been repackaged for consumption, all the other truths buried under more compelling narratives. Arjun called next, from what looked like an airport lounge. "I'm going to Berlin," he said, "teaching position at the film school there. Time to leave Mumbai for a while, let things cool down." He looked tired but oddly at peace. "The Colaba confession will never release, obviously. The streaming platforms pulled out. The distributors want nothing to do with it. 3 years of work, gone." "What will you teach?" Meera asked. "Ethics in filmmaking?" He laughed at the irony. "The importance of truth in storytelling. Learn from my mistakes, that sort of thing." "And Kabir?" "Kabir will survive. His family's already spinning this as him being deceived. Another victim of Justice Khanna's web of lies. He'll be producing reality shows within 6 months, mark my words." They were right about Kabir. Within a week, he had positioned himself as a crusader for justice who had unknowingly helped expose a killer by bringing attention back to the case. He gave interviews about the responsibility of filmmakers to question official narratives, conveniently forgetting his role in suppressing evidence. The media, always hungry for redemption stories, largely accepted his version of events. But the real aftermath was playing out in Mumbai's courts and streets. Justice Khanna's arrest had triggered a review of dozens of cases he'd presided over, particularly those involving powerful business interests. Patterns emerged of favoritism, of judgments that consistently benefited certain families and corporations. The same web of influence that had protected him for so long was now being mapped by journalists and activists who sensed an opportunity for long overdue accountability. Meera's article was published on a Thursday, timed for maximum impact before the weekend news cycle. It ran to 15,000 words, meticulously documented and legally vetted, laying out not just the murder and its cover-up, but the entire system that had made such a cover-up possible. She wrote about the production company's willingness to ignore evidence, the police's readiness to accept convenient suspects, the media's hunger for narrative over truth, and her own complicity in almost letting it happen. The response was immediate and polarizing. Film industry insiders accused her of betraying her profession, of biting the hand that fed her. Journalists praised her courage while privately wondering if they would have done the same. Legal experts debated the implications for future cases where media and justice intersected. But the response that mattered most to Meera came from Vikram Mehta, who sent a simple message from Dubai: "Thank you for giving me my life back." On the day the article was published, Ganesh Chaturthi began in Mumbai. The city transformed into a celebration of the elephant-headed god who removed obstacles and brought new beginnings. Meera watched from her window as processions passed below, carrying elaborate statues to be immersed in the sea. The symbolism wasn't lost on her: the dissolution of carefully crafted images, the return to elemental truth, the cycle of creation and destruction that defined both Mumbai and its stories. She met Ria one last time at Marine Drive, where they sat on the seawall watching the sunset paint the Arabian Sea in shades of gold and crimson. The monsoon had passed, leaving the city washed clean, though everyone knew the dirt would return soon enough. They didn't talk about the case, or the film, or justice. Instead, they talked about Priya, her love of old Bollywood songs, her terrible cooking, her dream of opening an animal shelter, all the small details that made her human rather than a headline. "Will you keep writing about crime?" Ria asked as the sun dipped toward the horizon. "I'll keep writing about truth," Meera replied. "Sometimes that involves crime. Sometimes it involves the stories we tell ourselves to avoid facing difficult realities. And the guilt about what happened to that witness in your earlier story." Meera thought about it, feeling the weight that had been her constant companion for 3 years. "The guilt remains, but I've learned that hiding from it, running to fiction to escape it, doesn't help anyone. The only way to honor those we've failed is to do better next time." And as night fell over Mumbai, the city's lights began their nightly show, millions of individual points creating a constellation of human ambition and struggle. Somewhere in those lights, Justice Khanna sat in a cell awaiting trial. Somewhere else, Vikram Mehta was booking a flight home. Arjun was boarding a plane to Berlin. Kabir was probably at a party, networking his way back to relevance. And across the city, in editing rooms and production offices, other films were being crafted from other tragedies. Other truths were being negotiated and packaged. The film that had brought them all together would never be seen by audiences, existing now only as a cautionary tale whispered in production meetings and journalism schools. But its real legacy was in the questions it had forced into the open. Who owns the truth? Who has the right to reshape tragedy into narrative? What responsibility do storytellers have to the real people whose lives they mine for content? Meera didn't have definitive answers to these questions, but she had learned that asking them insistently and publicly was perhaps the most important story she could tell. The real mystery behind the crime-based movie wasn't who killed Priya D'Souza. That had been solved. The real mystery was how an entire industry, an entire city, had been willing to accept a lie because it made for better entertainment than the truth. As she walked home through the streets of Mumbai, past the remnants of Ganesh festivities and the eternal construction that promised a future never quite delivered, Meera understood that her work was far from over. There would be other cases, other films, other moments when truth and narrative collided, and she would be there, notebook in hand, asking uncomfortable questions and refusing comfortable answers. Because in a city built on dreams and illusions, someone had to insist on reality, even when reality was harder to sell than fiction. The truth, she had learned, rarely provided the satisfying endings that movies promised. Justice Khanna would likely serve a reduced sentence, his connections ensuring comfortable imprisonment. The film industry would continue turning tragedy into content, perhaps with slightly more caution. The police would continue taking the path of least resistance in their investigations. But small things had changed. Vikram Mehta could return home. Ria D'Souza could begin properly grieving her sister. And somewhere in Mumbai, other journalists might think twice before accepting official narratives. Other filmmakers might hesitate before prioritizing drama over truth. It wasn't the dramatic transformation that movies promised, but it was real. And in a world where reality itself had become negotiable, that small victory felt like revolution enough. The real mystery behind the crime-based movie had been solved not with a climactic revelation, but with the slow, methodical work of investigation, the courage to speak truth to power, and the recognition that sometimes the most important stories were the ones that prevented false narratives from becoming accepted history. Mumbai's story continued, as it always did, messy and complicated and resistant to clean endings. But for once, at least, the truth had won a small victory over the more sellable lie.